Director, Dr. Charles Franklin. We're delighted to have him here, Charles, and we've got a lot of stuff to get to today. So let's begin, as we always do, by talking a bit about the sample and when we were in the field.
Okay, so we were in the field last Thursday through Sunday nights, the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th. We interviewed 803 people, which has a margin of error for the whole sample of plus or minus 4.2 percentage points. And for Republicans, the sample is 326 people. That has a margin of error of 6.6. And for Democrats, it's 374 and a margin of error of 6.1. So those are in line with what we normally do. We were 44% cell, 56% landline, which again is right where our target is. So.
Let's talk about the composition of the sample in terms of party ID and in terms of our historic norms, Charles.
So for actually the last several releases, we've been including this in the press release, so it's been there, but I figure it makes sense to bring this out directly as well right at the beginning because it's something people are interested in. So the comparison here is what is the partisan makeup of this month's sample compared to the long-term over 25,000 interviews we've done over the full time. And there are two ways to measure party ID. One is to count people who say they're independent but then say they lean to a party as partisans. They vote about 84 to 86% with their party, but not the 95% that real partisans vote. And then don't include them. So here's the first version, including them. In the current sample is 41 Republican, 47 Dem, 11 Independent. In that long run, it's 42, 47, 9. So quite close. Closer than that, and you worry about whether we're really doing a random sampling. And then for the non-lean version, it's 27 Republican, 31, 38. The long run is 27, 31, 39. So there we go. Remember that these numbers are subject to sampling variation just like everything else. So if the margin of error is plus or minus 4 over the next few polls, you should see these numbers fluctuate up and down by 2 or 3, or much more rarely, but occasionally we've seen some fluctuate by 4. But it happens this time that we're very, very close to the long run.
So we can say this is a fairly typical poll, if there is such a thing, a fairly typical poll in terms of the sample.
This certainly reflects our experience over 30 previous samples since 2012 in terms of the partisan ballot.
Something we wanted to touch on before we got too much further is to delve into when we were in the field, because as everybody in this room knows, a lot happened on Friday afternoon, the attacks in Paris. And so some of our polling, Charles, was done prior to the attack, some of it was done after. Did it have any impact on what we saw?
So Thursday's interviews were obviously before the attack. Friday's interviews were after the attack, but it depends on how fast people learned about the attacks in terms of how many people in the Friday night sample had heard or not heard. And then the Saturday and Sunday samples were late enough that I think it's a fair guess that everybody that's ever going to learn about them had heard about them by that point. So we looked to see if there were any differences, and the most interesting one that I'm going to give you the numbers for turns out not to show a statistically significant effect. So I want to emphasize that because looking at candidate favorability and looking at all of the horse race numbers, none of them show a statistically significant shift between the before and the after attack, okay? So the bottom line is there's no evidence of a change. The one that looks most plausible for an effect, I'll read you now, but you'll also see why it doesn't seem worth pursuing very much. President Obama's job approval is the one measure we have that's most obviously related to national and international affairs and security. On Thursday, he had a job approval rating of 45%. On Friday night's sample, it jumped to 51%, which if we just stop there, you say, oh, that's consistent with the well-known rally around the flag effect that when an international event occurs, president's approvals typically bump up. Whether it's a good event or a bad event, that's the norm. But on Saturday, it was back down to 46, and on Sunday at 47. So if this was an instantaneous rally effect, it also instantaneously vanished. And the lack of any credible statistical evidence that it was a real change makes me think we really shouldn't pursue this much. And then, having looked at all of the favorabilities of the candidates and the horse race matchups, none of them show a statistically significant difference across day and week. So for those reasons, we're not going to pursue this anymore. But it's an important question, well worth taking a look at.
So let's explore.
There's nothing to say that this doesn't matter in the longer term as the events and the further events that play out have an effect. This is only speaking to the question of whether there was a virtually instantaneous change, and there's no evidence that that occurred in the day of and the 2 days after.
Well, let's get into the data to a greater extent now. We're going to begin with looking at the GOP presidential primary in Wisconsin. The last time we were in the field, Charles, I think was late September. Let's begin there, and then maybe we can look at what the latest results show.
So, late September was actually the week after, or the week that Governor Walker dropped out of the race. And we saw Donald Trump jump to the lead there at 20%, followed by Carson at 16 and Rubio at 14. Fiorina was doing fairly well at that point at 11, and you see Bush and Paul. I'm going to present these split, the top 6, the middle 6, and the bottom. Here it is now. Carson has moved to first place by a smidgen at 22%, with Trump and Rubio both tied at 19. So the top 3 are the same, but Carson now a bit ahead. Cruz at 9, Bush at 6, and Fiorina's dropped off a bit to 5. So a little bit of movement at the top with Carson moving up. On the other hand, remember 6.6% margin of error, so these differences are not statistically significant. If we look at the rest of the pack, in September, you see Cruz, Kasich, Huckabee, Christie all at or below 5%, and Santorum and Pataki below that. That group this time includes Christie at 4%, but Paul, Kasich, and Huckabee are all at 1%, and everybody else is at 0, where they were last time as well. Bobby Jindal dropped out after we completed the survey, so he was included, but I don't think it affected his support very much. Sorry, you weren't supposed to see that one.
Well, that was
one too far.
That was September, and that was the Democratic candidates, and that was when
thank goodness.
Vice President Biden was still thinking about being a candidate.
Right. So Democrats, Clinton with a 12-point advantage, but Biden taking 17% of the vote. Of course, this time Biden's gone and Webb and Chafee are gone as well. So where are we? A 9-point Clinton advantage, 50 to 41 with O'Malley at 2 and the rest undecided.
Let's move on to the U.S. Senate race, which is the most hotly contested state election in Wisconsin in November of 2016. It appears the candidates will be Russ Feingold and Ron Johnson, so you'll have a rematch in 2010. Let's begin, Charles, by going back to September and then see how that compares with COVID.
So here we are in September. It was 50 to 36 with a scattering of don't knows and neithers. This time, it's about the same, 49 to 38. So Feingold down a point, Johnson up 2, still an 11-point Feingold advantage right now. We can also look at this over time. These are the 4 polls that we've done this year with that matchup. And I think what you can see is the second poll seemed to have tightened a bit. But if you just look at the average across those blue dots and across the red dots, what you see is that the blue line, the Feingold line, is about 49 plus or minus 1. And the red line for Johnson's about roughly 39 plus or minus a couple. So there's been some fluctuation in there. And in that second poll, it looked like it had narrowed. But then it came back, and now we have 2 that are showing roughly the same result. Feingold somewhere in the upper 40s, near 50. Johnson somewhere in the upper 30s, near 40. And we've got a long ways to go to see how this race shapes out.
Well, Charles, we've been trying to get at how much people know about these candidates in some of our polling. So let's look again at September and then November and see how people, what awareness there is of this race.
And the Senate race is interesting because of the limitations. Back in September, 55% knew both, and 20% knew neither of these two candidates. This time it's improved a little bit, but only a little. Both is now at 59, up 4 points, and neither's at 16, down 4 points. 19% of people know Feingold but don't know Johnson, and 6% know Johnson but don't know Feingold. And that's been a pattern that we've seen, and you'll see more of in just a second, that Senator Johnson remains less well known in the state than former Senator Feingold is.
We're going to look at some November numbers in terms of their favorability ratings. How do Russ Feingold and Ron Johnson fare with voters when you ask them, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of these guys?
Right. So here is Feingold, 42, this is this month, 42 favorable, 36 unfavorable. And the 21 that haven't heard plus the 1% don't know is what I call 22% who are unable to give a rating to the candidate. Okay? You'll see the trend on this in a little bit, but the bottom line is it's tightening some. If we move to Senator Johnson, it's 27 favorable, 38 unfavorable, and 35 that are unable to give a rating. So that's what I was referring to, that Senator Johnson's haven't heard enough and don't know together at 35 compared to the 22 for Feingold shows the difference between the two, and that's been long-standing. Senator Johnson has not become widely known in the state since we've been polling about him since 2012. Here's the trend over time, though, and this is maybe more important. So this is Feingold, and it's every poll we've asked favorability about him. And you can see the green line of favorability has bounced around a bit, but has been roughly flat over the last 3 polls. But his unfavorables, the purple line, has been rising over that time. So his net is still net more favorable than not, but the gap is tightening between those two. And you can also see some fall off in the don't know enough. With Senator Johnson, we have a longer time span. By the way, these were on the same scale, so the X's are the same, so you can see them comparatively. And you can see that first of all, the yellow line is the can't rate is really usually near the top for Johnson. And more recently, his favorables have sort of slowly trended down and then took a little step down over the last 2 polls, while his unfavorables have worked their way up a little bit over that time. So that he's, having been in the past mostly a small net favorable, has been a net unfavorable over the last 3 polls, with that widening a little bit. Okay? I stress one last time that we are just under a year away from Election Day. So this is the background. This is setting the stage for the race. Who knows what's going to happen? I'm going to wait for the returns on election.
We're going to jump back to the presidential race. We often do hypothetical head-to-head matchups between Republican candidates and Democratic candidates. We did this again this time, and Charles, we should say there's been a little movement since our last poll in terms of these party versus party matchups.
There certainly have been, and you'll see them as we put them up here, and I'll talk a little bit about them as well. So the first is Clinton versus Carson. Now has Carson ahead, 45 to 41, at 1 percentage point, right? 45-44, sorry. That 1 percentage point difference, of course, is well inside the margin of error. But it is the first time that we've seen any kind of an advantage. Actually, I should say, this is the first time we've measured Carson versus Clinton, so we don't actually have a comparison of that one from before. I want to contrast that with Sanders, who does a little bit better, 47-41 against Carson. And again, we don't have a previous measure to compare that to. But you'll see this in the next two comparisons we make as well, that Sanders is doing a little bit better against Republicans than Clinton is. And that's an interesting development moving forward. Now, against Rubio, Rubio also has a 1-point edge over Clinton, 45-44, the same as we saw before. But here we do have a September poll. And in September, Clinton was at 48 and Rubio at 40. So that's a 9-point net shift, reflecting Rubio's rise, which you saw back in the presidential primary, the Republican primary, and he's been boosted a bit. If we look at Sanders versus Rubio, though, Sanders has a small edge, again, not outside the margin of error, 46-42. So there's a little bit of an edge there. Against Trump, Clinton leads 48-38. Bear with me while I lose my place here. Here we go. That 48-38 this time compared to 50-36 in September. So where we have the two comparisons, you can see the race tightening of Clinton against Rubio or against Trump. But the important difference being Rubio having this very tiny edge, whereas Trump remains behind, but not quite as far behind. And finally, if we look at Sanders versus Trump, the margin is even bigger, 52-35. So again, consistent with what we see across all three of these candidates, Sanders seems to be doing a little bit better against the three Republicans than Clinton is doing. And that especially includes the two where Carson and Rubio have this edge.
Is there any readily available explanation for why Bernie Sanders is faring better than Hillary Clinton against Republican candidates?
Yeah, there's not an easy answer to this. Here's what the numbers show, and partly it's negative. You might think that it has something to do with who's willing to vote for the other guy if their person doesn't get the nomination. But if you look at Democrats who prefer Clinton, and then look at how they vote against any of these people, but I'll use Carson as the example. About 93-94% of Clinton voters vote for Clinton when it comes to Clinton versus Carson in the general. Of the Sanders voters, about 83% vote for Clinton, but about 13% jump over and vote for Ben Carson. The other socialist in the race, I guess. Sorry, it's just too easy to say that.
That's humor. I hope people.
That is humor. That was certainly
laughing when he said that. It was humor.
But the serious point about this is, you know, if you look at the knowledge of Sanders, it's not universal in the state yet at this point, whereas the feelings about Clinton are universal. So people have very well-formed opinions either for or against Clinton, but they're surprisingly malleable about Sanders at this point, for a lot of people at least. Likewise, there are more independents that vote for Sanders, and there's, again, somewhat surprisingly, some Republicans that are more likely to go for Sanders than they are to go for Clinton. And so it's not a simple pattern, but it's also especially not a simple matter of, if my candidate gets the nomination, I won't vote for your candidates, because when we flip it around and look at Sanders Democrats, they vote almost the same way the Hillary Democrats do. That is, about 94% of them vote for Sanders in the general, and about 80-83% vote for Clinton in the general. So the willingness not to vote for your party's nominee if your person didn't get the nomination is really almost identical between the Clinton voters and the Sanders voters. So any notion that, you know, these two are wildly different in their willingness to vote for the other candidate really is not borne out. Both of them show a drop-off of roughly 10 to 15 points in party loyalty when their candidate doesn't get the nomination. But Sanders does a little bit better job drawing over independent voters and drawing over a handful of Republican voters as well.
We've had another big development since we last polled, and that is Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan has become the Speaker of the House, the reluctant Speaker, but he is doing the job. And so we asked a couple of questions about Paul Ryan in this poll, Charles.
So one is we came back to favorability ratings for him. 49% favorable, 34 unfavorable. And remember what we were saying about don't know percentages, only 17% unable to rate him. Compare that with, that's better than Feingold and better than Johnson. It's also better than Paul Ryan in July before he was picked for the vice presidency, when 35% of the state couldn't give a rating to him. So that difference between the 35 then and the 17 now sort of tells you what's it worth to run for vice president, chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and now become speaker. The don't know rate has been cut in half from 35 to 17 that still aren't sure who you are. So that's pretty good. If we look at his trend over the long haul, you can see here at the very beginning, that's that summer before he was picked for vice president, you can see some sharp changes that happened in 2012. But since then, his favorables have been roughly similar, maybe have trended up a little bit. His unfavorables have maybe trended down just a little bit. And his don't know rate dropped precipitously early, started to climb back up, but has come back down, and maybe down just a little bit more this time in the light of coverage. So in the long run, better known, quite well liked by comparison with other candidates in the state.
What do they think this? What do people think this is going to mean for his district now that he's got this new set of responsibilities?
Right. So in the good old days, if you held a really important position in Congress, your district could expect to get some good things out of that. So we asked the question, do you think being Speaker will allow Representative Ryan to better represent the people of his district? Or will it necessarily pull his attention to other issues outside the district? And overwhelmingly, people think those outside issues are going to be important for him. It's not the same as saying he'll neglect the district, but faced with comparison, will he be able to help the district or pay attention to outside issues? Outside issues plays heavily. We're a long way from the bridge to nowhere that would get sent back to your district if you rose to power.
We're going to get into some state issues now, and we begin with a question that we've asked many times, and that is about the state of the state budget. Are we in better shape today, the same, or worse than we were just a few years ago?
Right. And so on that question, 30% say better, 24 the same, 39 say we're worse off. But if we look at the history of this over time, you can see a fairly sharp change that took place as we moved from 2014 to 2015. The green line for better was clearly well above the other two through 2014 and 2014, sorry, as we were asking this question. But in 2015 has dropped, or the green line has dropped and the yellow line has risen, so that now worse off is the highest number, followed by better and followed by the same. You can see that there's been relatively little change in those this year, at least in the worse off line. The same dipped down and has risen, and the better rose slightly and then dropped off in this latest sample. So during the spring of the budget debate, perhaps it wasn't surprising to see these concerns bounce up, but now we've gone through the budget debate. The budget was passed back in July, and opinions about it remain relatively more negative, certainly more negative than they were in 2014.
We've also been asking about job creation in Wisconsin. How are we faring compared to others? And again, you talked about the negative numbers on the budget. We see a bit of that here.
We do indeed. Is the state adding jobs faster, the same, or lagging behind other states? 57% now say lagging behind. Again, let me just show you this over time for the quickest and easiest view of this. You can see the lagging behind has actually been the highest of the three in most of our samples, but you can see again It has moved up in the 3 samples this year that we asked about it, and it's bumped up a little bit here in this latest sample as well. Adding jobs faster has never been very high, but has trended down slowly over this whole period. So much of the shifting is really going on between lagging behind and about the same. So from this, we're a bit pessimistic about the budget, but we're quite pessimistic about the jobs picture right now.
We've got a couple of interesting questions in here that deal with the issue of good news and bad news. How aware are people of good news and bad news? We asked first, Charles, whether or not people were aware, for example, of what's happening with the GE plant in Waukesha, where there's about 400 jobs that will move to Canada. We also asked about the Oscar Mayer plant in Madison, which will close, and 1,000 jobs will disappear there. How aware are people of those kinds of stories?
Right. And let me say, we asked these in random order, so half the people got a good news question and then a bad news question. The other half got it the other way around, so it varied. But here, have you heard about the plant closings at GE and at Oscar Mayer? 70% in the whole state had heard about that. 30% had not, and interestingly, nobody said they didn't know. If we ask about that by region, not surprisingly, the Milwaukee and Madison television markets, which is not just the city or the counties, it's the bigger area around. 76% in Milwaukee had heard, 88% in Madison, though the Oscar Mayer closing was more recent than the closing at GE, so it could be, it was a local thing in Madison, but it could also be it's a more recent thing there as well. But notice that it drops off a lot to just 56% in the rest of the state. Still, a majority of the rest of the state had heard about these, but you can see very sharply here the differences in attention we pay to the affairs of other regions of the state. If we flip this around and ask questions about how are things in Wausau, we might see a reverse of that with southeastern Wisconsin not being as aware of what's happening in Wausau as their marketplace.
And here's the good news question we asked. This was, people, for example, the Walker administration point out, hey, a distribution center opened in Kenosha County, Amazon opened that. You should look at that. Quad Graphics is bringing jobs from other states back to Wisconsin. They'll be adding jobs. So there is good news. Are people aware of the good news?
And yes, but not as much. Almost a dead even split. 50% had heard of Amazon, which is hiring people, and Quad Graphics, which has announced, ironically, I guess, consolidation of plants, but they're moving the jobs to Wisconsin rather than closing our plants and moving them elsewhere. Some other things have been in the news a good bit. Amazon has been putting banner ads up on news websites, hiring people at almost $15 an hour. So there's some good news out there, but we're not as likely to have heard it. Now, part of that could be because good news doesn't travel as fast as bad news. Part of it could also be that people simply are gripped more by bad news than by good news. And finally, it could be a difference in the amount of attention that news media pay to these two stories. We don't have any data to answer which of those is driving this difference of perceptions. But there is, again, a regional difference, and I think it shows the importance of media market, at least. And that is in the Milwaukee media market, where most of the Quad Graphics and all of the Amazon jobs are, we have pretty high awareness at 73%. But in Madison, which was equally aware, or even more aware of the plant closings, they look just like the rest of the state in terms of awareness, 36 and 33, aware of these additional jobs. If you do become aware of jobs, to be aware of jobs that are being created in your local area a little bit more so, whereas the closing information looked, even in the rest of the state, more than half knew about those plant closings.
Let's take a look at Governor Walker's job approval, Charles.
38 approved, 58 disapproved. This is 1 point change in both of those since last time. Last time it was 37.59. So here's the chart of the trend, and you can see just that 1 point shift at the very end. So we'll wait a while to see if this reflects a change in trend or whether it's just a one-term blip. But the main point you would again see is what a difference there is between the pattern we saw up through the fall of 2014 and the 2015 period. And time will tell if those trends really reverse or not.
We also asked a job approval question for both legislative Republicans and legislative Democrats.
So for Republicans, and the wording of the question is, do you approve or disapprove of the job Republicans in the state legislature are doing? Okay, no names because people are challenged to know the names of specific legislators. So 31% approve of the Republicans' handling of the job, 60% disapprove, and 9 say they don't know. For Democrats, it's 39 approve, 49 disapprove, don't know at 12. And one thing to notice is legislators normally and congressmen have lower approval ratings than individuals when you name them. So the difference between Walker's approval at 38, 7, 9, where it's been fluctuating, and legislative Republicans at 31, could be about the job people see the legislature's doing, but it can also be about how we just are not real fond of legislatures, whether it's the state legislature or the Congress. So take a little bit of leavening there in terms of the direct comparison. Nonetheless, it's fair to say that neither legislative party has sort of excelled at garnering public support for the job they're doing.
Let's take a look at these job approval ratings, Charles, for the governor and for both houses of the legislature, and look at by party ID.
Right. So this is Governor Walker, and you know, it's not going to surprise any of you in here that there are big party effects, but look at a couple of details. Big approval among Republicans, still a 2-to-1 approval among leaning Republicans, though this was up in the 80s in 2014. But losing the independents with just 29 approve and 58 disapprove, that's going to be a fairly important group to win back if he's going to raise his numbers. And it'll hardly surprise you that Democrats are not likely to cut Governor Walker much slack. So those are very highly negative. The one thing to think about is that these leaning Republicans do lean to the Republican Party, so maybe a little more inclined to see good things from any Republican, but a Republican governor in particular. So they have a little pressure to bring them back to his side. But the pure independents don't have that same kind of inclination. So we'll just watch this over time to see if these groups move back and how much of an effect it ultimately has on his overall approval rating.
Job approval for legislative Republicans.
Legislative Republicans, it's not as high among pure Republicans, but it's still quite a high net. But it's basically dead even among leaning Republicans between approve and disapprove, unlike Governor Walker, who was a 2-to-1 more favorable view. And it's a negative view among independents. And again, not very many Democratic supporters. But watch what happens when we flip it and look at the Democratic side of this. So read from right to left now. Democrats get, sorry, that's reversing the correct scale, isn't it? But anyway, reading on the right side here, 77% of Democrats think Democrats in the legislature are doing a good job, strong approval. And they get a net positive, though not as big a net positive among leaning. But look at the independents here who are actually more negative towards legislative Democrats than they were back up towards legislative Republicans. So it's an interesting question, which unfortunately I can't answer today, about what is it about legislative Democrats that makes independents more negative about them. Okay? That's just an interesting puzzle for us to wonder about. And then you can see that Republican identifiers are quite united in their opposition to legislative Democrats. Again, no more surprising than for the Democrats on the previous slide.
There's actually been a lot going on in Madison in the last few months. A lot of different pieces of legislation have been acted on. There's been a fair amount of media attention, I'd say more than even a fair amount of media attention. And so we wanted to look at the public awareness of some of these issues. And these results are very interesting, Charles.
Yeah. And this is nice in a couple of ways. One is that back in September, we had a full agenda on the survey, so we weren't able to spend as much time on state policy as we normally do. So this time we're able to come back and ask about these. And this first table or chart is going to show you what percentage of the public say they either haven't heard of an issue or don't know what their position is on the issue. All 6 of these issues, I would go further than Mike on this, I think have been very heavily covered in news and print and broadcast, and certainly they've been hotly debated issues within the legislature. And yet you're going to see substantial variation in how aware, or in this case, unaware people are of these. And I want to start with this before we move to what people prefer, whether they support or oppose the proposal. I should also send you to the instrument online for the exact wording of the questions. We didn't try, and it would be foolish to try, to summarize an entire bill in one question, right? It's just too complicated. So we're picking out some highlights of proposals, not saying this is everything that the bill does, because every one of these bills is far more complicated than that. I'll summarize them verbally for you now, but if you want to know the exact wording, go to the survey questionnaire online to see exactly how we worded it. So with that as the introduction, here we go. Percent unaware of civil service reform, half. Percent unaware of restructuring the Government Accountability Board, 47%. Borrowing $350 million more for highways, 28%. Doubling campaign contributions and allowing unlimited contributions by individuals to parties, 26%. Creating a new state agency or authority to refinance student loans, 24%, haven't heard of that. And finally, instituting a ban on fetal tissue from abortions being used in medical research, 19%. I think you can also see a certain understandable pattern here that hot button issues like fetal tissue ban, where people are very engaged on the issue, people hear about and they have an opinion about. Whereas government agencies, replacing the civil service exam with a resume-based method of hiring, and splitting the Government Accountability Board in two and replacing its board with equal numbers of partisans instead of retired judges. Those are awfully bureaucratic kinds of things. You wouldn't imagine very many people jump up first thing in the morning and say, I'm going to spend my day thinking about civil service. So it's not shocking that these are the numbers, but certainly GAB has been something that's been talked about constantly for months and months and months, and just came up for a vote in the period that we were in the field on this. So if it were ever going to rise in public salience, you would think this is where it would be. Okay?
Charles, let's begin, and we'll look at how people who are aware of these things feel about them. Let's begin with the student loans. This is the, I think it's Representative Corey Mason from Racine and Dave Hansen, the senator from Green Bay, who have this idea that you could create a refinance or an authority that would refinance student loans. How do people feel about that idea?
61% think it would be support the idea. All of these were asked, do you support or oppose the following proposal? Okay? And again, just summarized, we didn't try to do everything. 15% opposed, and then over on the right, you can see the total of 24%. 23 had not heard, and 1% said they didn't know. And to help you, as we go through these, I've put them in the order of support minus opposition, so you can see how big the plurality was. And so we're going from the strongest support to the least support. Net support, I should say, because some of these have so many don't knows that support is lower, but the gap is still higher.
How about changes to civil service?
Change to civil service, 30% support, 19 opposed, so that's a net plus 11 supporting doing away with the civil service exam and moving to resume-based hiring for state workers.
Borrowing.
But again, you see we have a lot of don't knows.
Borrowing
Borrowing for roads, 38% support, 34 opposed. This is actually in line with when we've asked this, because this has been an ongoing issue. We borrowed in the last budget as well. So this is a question we've asked repeatedly over time. People are very opposed to borrowing in principle, but in both years, both budget years, when we came down to the end, we saw small majorities willing to do the borrowing rather than not. And so this is in line with that.
The replacing of the GAB with these
Yep.
two separate commissions.
So support 25%, opposed 28%. We've now just passed the point where we flipped over to a little bit more opposed than support. But again, very large, 47% don't know, and not a big difference there. Here is fetal tissue ban, 32% support, 47 opposed, and 19 don't have an opinion. And doubling campaign contribution limits and allowing unlimited individual contributions to parties, 13% support, 61% opposed. So that's sort of the opposite end. One footnote on this one, we did not try to squeeze in to the question the amounts that are being doubled, because they're fairly modest amounts, up to 1,000 and up to 2,000. But it would have complicated the question a lot to have included that. Perhaps knowing what those amounts are would make a difference, though I imagine that the unlimited individual contributions to parties, which is part of the bill, also plays a role in people's opinions here.
Charles, this has been an interesting election cycle. We've seen the emergence of outsiders, whether it's Donald Trump or Ben Carson, even Kearney, and we've seen them do pretty well so far in the presidential primary process, at least this very preliminary part of the process. What do people think about this? Is it more important to have government experience, or is it more important to be an outsider and not be tied in with all those government folks?
That's right. Well, about equal. 49% say they'd like an experienced president, but 45% think they'd like an outsider, not part of the establishment. When you look at it by party, there are pretty big differences. 61% of Republicans go for the outsider, 77% of Democrats go for the experience, but independents are particularly interesting, going 55 to 39 in favor of the outsider. So, how you define an outsider and exactly who that candidate is a different question than this sort of general question. But it certainly shows that the disaffection for establishment experienced politicians is strong in the Republican Party, but also exists among independents as well. Perhaps you could argue that the nature of the candidates in the GOP encourages those feelings, whereas the nature of the candidates in the Democratic race right now does not provide an obvious outsider. So maybe there's an element there that could change if there were a new, bold outsider Democrat in the race this time or next time.
I've heard a few veteran politicians lament that compromise is dead in politics. That's now a dirty word. We asked a question about that dirty word in our poll.
It's surprising that you can actually use compromise in polite society. Voters are overwhelmingly in favor of someone who would be willing to compromise. Now, the way we asked this question tried to balance the two sides to make them roughly attractive. So, would you prefer someone who won't compromise their principles, which I at least think sounds like a fairly positive reason not to compromise? Or would you like someone who's willing to compromise to accomplish some of their goals? The old, I'd rather have half a loaf than nothing, right? So we tried to balance the inherent attractiveness of these two options, but this 78% in favor of compromise is pretty striking. And we've asked variants of this question in the past about the state legislature, for example, And again, we see a lot of support for compromise. If we dig down a little bit, there are some party differences, but even among Republicans, where you might think this opinion is strongest, 68 are in favor of compromise, only 27 are opposed to it. And even if you look at Tea Party supporters within the Republican Party, it's slightly over 50% of Tea Party supporters that would support compromise, something in the mid-40s that would oppose compromise. So, this is something where I guess you can say this is cheap talk. We all want everybody to live happily together, and that involves compromise. But it does sort of run against the narrative that says unwillingness to find any kind of accommodation has massive public support. Really, there's not a group here, and even including Tea Party supporters, where it's really true that the majority opinion, let alone the large majority opinion, favors sticking to your principles regardless.
Charles and I were talking about this earlier today, and I told him that the mood of the electorate today reminds me a little bit, actually, of 2010. We were still in the midst of the recession, and things have changed some since then, but you still get the feeling, Charles, that there's a pretty unhappy, even angry electorate at times. And we tried to get at that in this poll.
Right. And we tried to do it in a way a little different from some other polls. Some polls just say, are you angry? Not at the moment. Or, yes, why are you interrupting my dinner? So I didn't want to ask that question. It's open to interpretation. But we went back to some items, some of which we've asked before, and some of which are new, to try to get some elements of what people are feeling strongly or not strongly about. I will say, we asked this as agree strongly, agree, disagree strongly, but I've collapsed the agree and disagree to just make it simpler to talk about the raw versions and the stuff online if you really care about differences in intensity. But a golden oldie, and one that has traditionally over time shown very large levels of agreement, is this one. Do you think government is run by a few big special interests who are just out for themselves? 84% agree with that statement. Only 14 disagree. And this has had a very large support over time. In our polling, it's been up in the 80s. In national polling, it tends to be that high. If we break it down by party, there's a little bit of difference. 72% of Republicans think big business is running government, but 91 of Dems and 86 of independents. So Dems and independents are a little closer together. Republicans a little bit less, but it's still, 3-to-1 majority of Republicans who think big interests are controlling the government. The question across the parties is what to do about that problem. But all parties seem to agree that this is a problem. If we look at whether government ignores the interests of hardworking Americans, a phrase that we hear fairly frequently, 69% agree, 28 disagree. And by party, it's almost exactly the same across the spectrum. 66 of Republicans, 70 of them, 70 of independents. That's interesting from a political messaging point of view, because if a Republican talks about government ignoring hardworking Americans, there's a receptive audience for that rhetoric among Democrats as well. Likewise, if a Democrat talks about it in those terms, there's a receptive audience among Republicans, as opposed to cases where we see big differences between the parties, which you're going to see in just a second. Okay? Moving on.
Yeah.
How about government's taking away my personal freedom and liberties? And liberties didn't make the title line there, but this is, again, a bit of rhetoric that we're hearing a fair bit about. It's a little bit lower in agreement, 59, but 39 disagree. And here we see more partisan differences. Republicans are quite concerned about this. 71% agree, 28 disagree. Democrats, by a moderate margin, go the other way. 55 disagree, 42, though, do agree. But the independents over there on the right, in this case, earlier we saw independents looking more like Democrats. Now they look more like Republicans on this question. And so that's a worthwhile thing to think a little bit about. So we'll stop there.
Well,
sorry.
No, it's fine.
And what about income differences? Something that's been much talked about recently. And again, a large percentage, this one goes back to 69, so this is like the second highest agreement rate on this, that income differences in the country have gotten too large. So there's big agreement, 28% disagree, but guess what? There's some differences in opinion across parties. Republicans are less likely to agree that income differences are too large, though just a modest 10-point difference there. Democrats, though, are overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, 90% say differences are too large. And among independents, it's in between, but a little bit more like the Democrats than like the Republicans. But here's the rub, right?
Right.
What should we do about that? Dead even split, 48-49, on should government do something to reduce income differences. And by party, mirror opposites between the two parties. Republicans, 22% government should address income differences, 75% opposition. Among Democrats, the exact opposite, 73-23, government should do something about it. And thinking about coalition politics, where are the independents? They're actually in between, in a way up for grabs between these two, with a 46-52 split, essentially even, close to even. Though slightly tilting for government shouldn't do anything about this. So when we hear about angry voters, I think as you go through these 5 items, there's a lot to see there as a basis for anger. That government's run by big business interests, or big interests, not big business, big interests. That it doesn't pay attention to hardworking people, that income differences are too big. We get pretty big majorities on all of those. And on some, partisans are pretty much in agreement, like government ignoring hardworking Americans. But on others, like this one at the end, there's a gigantic gap between the two parties in terms of how they would address that issue. So I think my closing point here is, when we talk about angry voters, I think there's empirical evidence to say, yes, there are quite a few angry voters, and they actually exist in both parties. But they're not necessarily angry about the same things, and certainly the solutions they would support, as this last one shows, can be dramatically different. So angry, yes, but it's a little more complicated than anger.
We encourage you to go to the website, as Charles mentioned, check out the full questions and also the complete results. There are also favorability ratings for a lot of the presidential candidates, for instance, which are made for interesting reading. We've got time for about 2 or 3 questions, so if you have a question, raise your hand. You're right out of the blocks quickly there, I like that. So you know how to do this stuff. Since you're a student, you know how to do this. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think with Ben Carson and Donald Trump staying in the league so long, many establishment GOP people, really any establishment person, is quite surprised. With Iowa caucuses less than 3 months away now, and then still being in the lead, what happens? What are the GOP's options if Donald Trump wins the nomination?
Sure. I think this is a good question and a good thing for us to talk a little bit about. Most analysts, if you will, say that in the history of presidential nominations, the last person who hadn't previously been elected to office to actually run for, get nominated, and win the presidency was Dwight Eisenhower, and he just won the war in Europe, so pretty good resume. Before that, you're back to 1940 with Wendell Willkie, a lawyer who was nominated at the convention. So it doesn't happen very often, and so part of the reluctance to believe that any of the 3 never elected people could ultimately be the nominee rests on that long history. Steve Forbes, for example, in the past, a businessman, has a bit of a bubble early on, but then falls out of the race. So that's one reason why there's been skepticism, aside from the personalities here. why there's been skepticism that one of these non-elected officials is likely to make it into the end game. So that's the beginning. The but is, if you didn't tell anybody the names and you simply said, here's a candidate who's ridden at the top of the polls, or two candidates that have consistently been in number one and number two across state and national polls for the most part since July, I think under any other circumstances you'd say those are the front runners for the nomination. And so it's the surprise that it's these two non-elected people who are doing so well so consistently that makes partisans and non-partisans both go, how can this actually happen? So I think we'll wait and see, but I really think the point here is voters in the party are ultimately going to decide this thing. Right? We are going to have voters go out to those caucuses in a cold February night. We are going to have voters show up in New Hampshire and South Carolina and the SEC primary and so on. So in the end, the fate of the party does rest on what those voters ultimately choose to do. And that we will just wait and see if the conventional wisdom that non-electeds fade holds in the end, or whether the voters, in their wisdom this year, decide to go with an outsider. And you see from the data today why there is some support for that sort of outsider candidate, especially within the Republican Party. So wait and see, but I think there is an argument at this point to be recognized that if the voters are really in the mood to nominate someone with no elected experience, it's in their hands through the primaries and caucuses.
Yes, sir.
Earlier you asked the question, is the budget better? What does better mean?
Yeah, whatever it means to the voter. Obviously, people could have different conceptions of what better means. My favorite programs have been cut, so it's worse no matter what the balance of the budget means. So we don't provide more of a context to that for people. We just say, would you say the situation with the Wisconsin budget is better off now, the same, or worse? And so it's up to the voter to make a decision about that. So I can't answer you any better than that.
Yeah.
With the 2016 presidential election, which way trains were going between Feingold or Johnson?
Well, I think what's striking to me is that over the 4 times we've repeated the question, if you just average that, it's been pretty stable. It's been Feingold with an average of roughly 49, plus or minus a couple of points, and Johnson at roughly 39, plus or minus a couple of points. So, and one of those was decidedly closer than the others, but 3 out of the 4 are all right in that range. What I do think we're seeing already is both of them are developing more net negative evaluations. Negative. Senator Feingold started very positive at a net 21 at the beginning of the year, but is now a net single digits positive. And the comparison is Tommy Thompson in the 2012 Senate race, who entered the year with a net favorability of plus 18, but ended the year with a net negative 14. And so that's a great example of how, an iconic long-term elected official in the state could start out incredibly popular, but end up quite negative. The Feingold numbers have not turned negative yet, but they're trending to being less positive. The Johnson numbers started a little bit positive and are now more negative. I would expect we'd see at the end of the election something like we saw in 2012, where both Thompson and Baldwin had net negative favorabilities. In that sense, the attacks that each side launches against the other is effective, and we end up with net negative views of both candidates. And then it becomes a question of what other factors other than sheer popularity or attractiveness, including the ability to get out your base vote, what's going on at the top of the ticket, what kind of presidential year do we end up with, if we end up with the incredibly close race that the Clinton versus Rubio or Clinton versus Carson numbers showed, that would be putting us back in like 2004 or 2000, where we had a razor-thin race. And then what happens down ballot? Whereas suppose a Republican wins the presidency handily, that would obviously help Republicans down the ballot. What if a Republican presidential candidate loses more badly? Then we would be hurting the races down ballot. So my crystal ball is pretty gray, except for that likely trend of both of them ending up more unpopular than popular.
We're going to wrap things up there. We will be active in the coming election year. More polling to come. Big election year, and should be interesting. We hope you will join us for future events, and also we encourage you to go to the law.marquette.edu website. We'll be updating our On the Issues schedule for the coming spring. Again, we appreciate your time, very interesting. Thanks for being with us today. We'll see you next time on the Issues.